Hello, and welcome, fellow seekers of Adam, to a video I have been wanting to make for some time now. Many of you no doubt thought for yourself while playing through Fallout 3, or heard from some corner of the internet, that Fallout 3's Wasteland and plot seem to be out of place for a game that takes place exactly 200 years after the Great War. I have gone through the arguments for and against, and I am presenting the evidence for the theory that Fallout 3 should take place much earlier. I have been convinced, and maybe you will too after finishing the video. For those that might be new to the channel, I am glad you are here, and I want to let you know that at the end of every video, I have a comment highlight where I go over some of the comments on my previously uploaded video. If you have something informative or funny to say, you might see it in a future video, Adam willing of course. I am also creeping up on 50,000 subs, and wanted to do a little something special for you all, so if you have an idea for an extra video outside of Fallout lore that you would like to see me do in order to celebrate, let me know in the comments. So to start things off, I want to state that there are a few important things to establish at the outset. The first is that many people believe this argument that Fallout 3 was meant to take place earlier is a stick to beat Bethesda with, and often, they are right. However, that is not the explicit or implicit point of this video. The point is merely to argue what I believe is a well-substantiated claim that Fallout 3 was originally meant to take place earlier in the timeline than it did. Just so everyone knows my personal opinion of Fallout 3, I actually hold it in high regard, probably due to the fact that it was the Fallout game that introduced me to the series. It is tied with New Vegas as my favorite Fallout game, which I love for different reasons, and if I'm being truly honest, there's a good chance part of my love for Fallout 3 comes from the nostalgia. I just want to make the point clear that I don't actually care if Fallout 3 was initially designed to take place earlier. I enjoyed reading the online debates and looking into the lore myself, to see what side I found myself landing on. And, if you haven't figured it out by now, I do think the evidence is very strong that Fallout 3 was originally not meant to take place 200 years after the Great War. Additionally, there are a few points that people will mention when having this discussion that I am not going to acknowledge. The persistence of widespread radiation, the state of heavy destruction that has not been cleaned or fixed, and why there seems to be so much stuff still left lying around are not topics I will cover in this video. Bethesda has shown with all subsequent games after Fallout 3 that they have a different philosophy when it comes to the Wasteland, and that includes persistent radiation, widespread destruction, and items like leftover pre-war food being commonplace in the Wasteland despite it being over 200 years after the Great War. Fallout New Vegas, Fallout 4, and Fallout 76, which admittedly has a valid excuse since it takes place so close to the Great War, share these traits, and whether you like it or not, it seems like this is how Bethesda chooses to have their Wasteland. If you don't like it, go rage tweet at Pete Hines, or stick another pin in your Todd Howard voodoo doll or something. The points that I talk about are in descending order from the weakest to what are, in my opinion, the strongest arguments, and evidences for Fallout 3 being a game lost in time. On to the video. Number 1. Bethesda has not released design documents for Fallout 3. I did say that we were starting with the weakest, right? This is not unique to Fallout 3. In fact, all the Bethesda Fallouts have had very little relating to their design evolution publicly shown. Design documents are the single best thing that would confirm this theory, just short of any developers directly acknowledging Fallout 3's timeline change. Of course, there is reasonable justification for not releasing design documents, since future Fallout games could take inspiration from the ideas contained in the design documents. Like Fallout 4 spinning a side quest from Fallout 3 involving a runaway android into a whole game with a brand new faction. This is the most forgivable of all, and therefore is mentioned as number 1. But to any Bethesda employees that might listen to this, you know what you need to do. Leak those documents to raddaddy69@hotmail.com and I'll handle the rest. Number 2. Fallout 3 has a higher emphasis on pre-war culture. The Wastelanders in Fallout 3 share a fascination with pre-war culture that outstrips all the other games, especially the Interplay Fallout games. While Bethesda as a whole has made this more prevalent in their own games, think of the Kings in Fallout New Vegas or Mo Cronin in Fallout 4 selling baseball bats from his Swada's store, Fallout 3, more than any other title, shows Wastelanders exhibiting fascination with the pre-war and efforts to understand or emulate pre-war culture. One of the few examples is the Ice Gang Sudden Death Overtime that look to bring back the hockey teams of old to the Wasteland in a, shall we say, slightly modified form. Slaves in Fallout 3 know about and look up to Abraham Lincoln as a symbol for their freedom, to the point that they wish to move into the Lincoln Memorial. Rivet City has a dedicated museum and society known as the Capitol Preservation Society, run by Abraham Washington, that is dedicated to preserving American history, with some rather impressive pieces like an entire P-51 in remarkable condition, as well as invaluable historical documents from the founding of the United States. Although the United States is in no way, shape, or form still a functioning nation, and 200 years has passed since the day that the country was destroyed, there are a surprisingly high number of people that want to preserve the history and even claim that they are doing so out of patriotic duty to their country. The creepy little town of Andale is such an example that attempts to recreate the idyllic pre-war neighborhoods that perished so long ago. Talking, dressing, and acting like a town that somehow escaped the apocalypse, they will proclaim themselves happy citizens of the United States, fulfilling their duty by electing a new governor. These are not all the examples I could have mentioned, like Sierra Petrovita and her Nuka-Cola obsession, but constitute some of the best and most notable examples which outnumber the examples from Fallout New Vegas or Fallout 4, as well as obviously Fallout and Fallout 2. Having so many Wastelanders not only aware of a time and culture that is 200 years past would make more sense if the pre-war world was in fact much closer. For reference, 1976 would be 200 years past the official Declaration of Independence in the United States, and the difference between the state of the country in 1776 and 1976 is staggering. Obviously, this is not a direct comparison, seeing as the people of Fallout are rebuilding from a once great and now destroyed world that has been subjected to unfathomable destruction. Still, unusually high interest of Wastelanders in pre-war culture would make the most sense if the memories of the pre-war either lived on in some survivors' minds, or were not stale and forgotten from multiple generations passing between the Great War and when Fallout 3 takes place. I can hear a number of you now saying that the most well-known factions in the game have made the pre-war as part of their identity, like the Brotherhood of Steel specifically looking to recover old tech, and the Enclave claiming to be the legitimate governing body of the United States. The difference here is not the focus of well-established factions, but the average Wastelander whose greatest concern is how to survive the day-to-day, and for whom reliving the pre-war culture has absolutely no benefit. What does it matter to be a citizen of a country neither they nor their grandparents ever even knew, especially when the most pressing concerns are where your next meals will come from, or how you are going to defend yourself from a raider attack at night? While I readily admit that this is far from a silver bullet, it is just one of the many reasons why I think Fallout 3 was meant to take place much earlier. Number 3. Including the Brotherhood of Steel and the Enclave. One of the many counter-arguments to this theory is that the Enclave and Brotherhood of Steel seem to have been planned as main factions from a very early stage. Indeed, there is not much to indicate that they were haphazardly thrown into the story, and Bethesda would never feature two well-established factions well before the events of Fallout or Fallout 2, right? Did I make that too obvious? You guys probably know exactly where I'm going with this, since the latest Fallout game to grace our lives did that exact thing. 25 years after the Great War in 2077, Vault 76 opens to a world that survived the apocalypse, but then was taken out by a completely different threat. In just those 25 years, the Appalachian Brotherhood of Steel was founded and established itself as a formidable faction, and the Enclave bioengineered the monsters that would do what the world-ending nuclear war could not, and that is kill and drive off all humans in the region. It is obvious that placing well-known factions in different parts of the United States at much earlier times than previously thought possible will not dissuade Bethesda. The Enclave may actually have some justifications, as Fallout 2 mentions in passing, as well as in image backgrounds, that there are a number of Enclave bases, outposts, or bunkers across the United States. The Brotherhood of Steel, on the other hand, is known to have originated from one specific location in California, so having them appear a short time after the Great War on the entire opposite side of the United States is surprising. Whether or not you put much stock into that explanation is beside the point. Bethesda found a way to introduce the Brotherhood of Steel much earlier and very far away from the Brotherhood's birthplace, communicating via radio all the tenets of the Brotherhood, their command structure, and even their exact logo, and I would have loved to hear that conversation. Yeah, so draw a sword standing on its hilt. Yeah, it's kind of long and skinny. Good. Now draw a circle around the upper portion of the blade. Make it big, because there are some gears in there. Yeah, gears. Don't worry about it right now. Anyway, around the hilt, draw some wings that stretch out and up around the circle. Don't make them all feathery and soft. We're the Brotherhood of Steel. Make those suckers sharp and pokey. Yeah, the pokier the better. Okay, the gears. There's one big one and two little ones. The big one's in the top right and the little one's bottom left. Yeah, have them touch. How many teeth? I don't know how. Listen, just draw some damn gears and go recover technology. The Brotherhood doesn't have time for this nonsense. Yeah, love you too. Bye. Or maybe they just used Fallout's version of a fax. So this point is not direct confirmation of the theory, rather it is a refutation of a common critique, which can also address why the Fallout 3 Enclave would have different armor. Bethesda has not been shy when it comes to adding new types and versions of power armor. There are so many now that it is hard to keep track of, and many of the new ones were introduced again in Fallout 76, which takes place very close to the time of the Great War. And to quote that one guy, it just works. Having the Brotherhood of Steel, Enclave, and unique armor and weapons would not have been an impediment to Fallout 3 taking place closer to the Great War, and Bethesda themselves have proven that. Number 4. No regional government in Fallout 3. In the 2 centuries from the time the bombs changed absolutely everything to the moment the Lone Wanderer escaped Vault 101, there's not been a single regional government that originated in the capital Wasteland. Not one. In the time it takes for empires and superpowers to rise and fall, there hasn't been a single governing body that exerted control over anything more than a settlement. This is in contrast to every single Fallout game except Fallout 1 and Fallout 76, with 76 standing as an exception because of how closely it takes place after the Great War. But even then, there were some factions that were close and could arguably be considered a loose form of a regional government. To show how this stands in contrast to all the other games except the 2 games that take place earlier, Fallout 1 and Fallout 76, let's look at the other games. As we do, it may be surprising, or it may not be, that regional governing bodies took a good amount of time to establish themselves in the Wasteland. I think it is also important to define a regional government as well. Small communities sprang up very early in post-war America as it provided protection and mutual aid. Some of these communities grew larger, but never exerted much control outside of their own community, and therefore were not any sort of regional governing body. As soon as these large communities gathered enough strength militarily or economically to project power onto other communities, they are becoming a regional power. A well-established regional power has a region under direct control and a larger region of influence outside of that. I will leave it as that, as it only makes this video more complicated to more rigidly define these terms, and these definitions are good enough. The first Fallout begins in 2161, 84 years after the Great War. By the definitions I just described, there are no established regional powers in this portion of the Wasteland, although there are some factions that are very close. The Hub is not a unified faction, but is a very important settlement that is run by a council of representatives from the large trading companies that are located there. The Hub dominates trade, and the currency accepted across the region is tied to bottle caps because of the water merchants and their immense influence earlier in Fallout history. The Crimson Caravan is the premier trading company in the region due to their willingness to do any job and to do it well, which means they have a disproportionate amount of influence in the region. The Hub would be considered a regional power in the making. However, the lack of a unified governing body and lack of direct control over an area outside of the Hub means they aren't quite there. Likewise, the Unity, the faction started by the Master, is operating largely in secret, but has arguably the most military capability of any faction, operating at the Mariposa military base and under the guise of a religion in the Boneyard. The Master's intentions, of course, are that of domination, and that is justified through claiming super mutants are the logical evolution of mankind to a greater existence. Once again, however, the Unity is not a regional power, although it has the underpinnings of one, and if the Master had been successful, likely would have exerted control over a large area until, well, I guess he would finally figure out for himself that the super mutants cannot breed amongst themselves. The Brotherhood is a notable faction but keeps largely to themselves, with well-defined goals to recover and preserve pre-war technology and maintain their exclusive regimented hierarchy, and therefore would not qualify as a regional power. The first Fallout does not have a regional government, but based on the events and groups that exist 84 years after the Great War, it is evident that larger powers are very soon to come. Fallout 2 takes place in 2241, 164 years after the Great War, and 80 years after Fallout 1. So Fallout 2 is as far away from the first Fallout as the first Fallout is to the Great War. Covering a much larger area, some of which overlaps with Fallout 1, Fallout 2 has a few regional powers. The NCR is the largest and most obvious of all the groups, having grown from the humble town of Shady Sands into the most influential and ambitious of all the major players. Borrowing its form of governance from pre-war nation-states, the NCR eyes settlements and cities in the Wasteland and uses diplomatic pressure where it can to convince groups to join the Republic. Where those diplomatic efforts fail, underhanded tactics prevail, like the NCR striking a deal with the Bishop family of New Reno to initiate attacks on Vault City to pressure them into joining the NCR. By the time of Fallout 2, the NCR is the largest power in the region and eagerly expanding. New Reno is another regional power that has been propositioned by the NCR, but by the time the game takes place, are still independent. New Reno is another regional power that has been propositioned by the NCR, but still at the time the game takes place, maintain their independence. New Reno is controlled by competing families and therefore does not have strong leadership or a central command structure. Nonetheless, they project their influence in a number of ways, like one of the families hooking as many people as possible in the mining town of Redding on Jet in order to control them, and therefore control the best source of gold in this corner of the Wasteland. Separately, the Bishops begin organizing and funding attacks against Vault City to bully them into an alliance with the NCR and New Reno, and the Salvatores are one of the few factions that have direct contact and dealings with the Enclave, providing them with needed chemicals for FEV research in return for laser weaponry. New Reno would be a serious player in the region if the families could come together to create strong leadership, but the lack of unity keeps New Reno from ever achieving the ambitious goals of the families. Lastly, I would consider the Enclave to be the third regional power. They have the ability to expand and rebuild, like what they have done at their Navarro base, have interactions with groups in the Wasteland, like trading with the Salvatores, and can be seen to project their military might to great effect, although often it is accomplished with surgical operations. This can be seen as they attack and enslave the starting village of Arroyo, as well as finding and massacring the intelligent Deathclaws of Vault 13. Although still quite secretive, they are shaping the Wasteland in many ways beyond their home at the oil rig, and are easily considered a regional power. There are a few regional powers in the making, like Vault City and the Shi, who have the size and manpower to project their influence and expand, but have yet to do so in any meaningful way. So for those of you that are counting, that is 3 regional powers and at least 2 potential regional powers about 80 years after Fallout 1. Fallout New Vegas takes place 40 years after the events of Fallout 2, and with a few exceptions, lies completely outside of the map areas from the 2 previous Fallout games. The NCR is back and in control, I'm using air quotes here, of most of the area around New Vegas. Having stretched their supplies too thin, they are essentially the NCR of Fallout 2 ideologically speaking, although they don't seem quite as powerful. The NCR's ambition has been checked in this region by the other regional power that is every bit its equal militarily. The Legion is a new menace, coming from the east, getting its start in Arizona by conquering and uniting tribes under the banner of the Bull, and under the leadership of one bad Mormon missionary and an ex-follower of the Apocalypse known as Kaisar. Expanding in the old territories of Arizona, Utah, and Nevada, New Vegas is the prize for which the Legion and the NCR vie over. But New Vegas is not helpless, as it is the third regional power within this game. The mysterious Mr. House prepared New Vegas and himself for greatness, defending it from ICBMs that would have reduced the city to rubble. Preserving his mind, and his body, kinda, he awoke well after the Great War to set in motion his plans to make New Vegas into a major power in the post-apocalypse. With a large army of Securitrons at his disposal and control of New Vegas, House hasn't had the opportunity to completely project his power, and for this reason, may not be considered a true regional power. But I think New Vegas, under House, makes the cut. There are a few groups that may have the means to resist the larger powers, at least for some time, like the Boomers, but all these groups stand in stark contrast to the absolute powerhouses that are the NCR and Legion, who represent the most powerful factions we have seen to date. Fallout 4 takes place in 2287, the latest of all the games that have been released. The Boston area is a rather lawless place, all things considered, but this is not for a lack of trying. The regional powers are a bit more complicated, but what better place to start than with the Institute? Descending from the scientists and researchers of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, the Institute continued its ambitious research, which evolved toward humanoid robots and eventually synthetic organic beings that are used to infiltrate groups and communities in the Commonwealth to gather intelligence, sabotage, and subtly influence events. Hiding below ground until the time comes where they can truly use their technological edge to project power, they are opposed and hunted by the Brotherhood of Steel, who are new arrivals to the Commonwealth. Hailing from the capital Wasteland, the Brotherhood of Steel have grown strong enough to not just send scouting missions far afield, but to completely invade and easily control land in a place as hotly contested as the Commonwealth, which is a testament to their military capabilities. While the Brotherhood is actively seeking to destroy the Institute, they will oppose any group that so much as inconveniences them on their mission. The Minutemen are a coalition of settlers throughout the Commonwealth that work together to institute law and order and mutual defense against the numerous threats in the Wasteland. The group is on the ropes and widely considered to be defunct by the time Fallout 4 starts, but can be revitalized to the point that they can reclaim their old base known as the Castle. The Minutemen have the capability of returning to their previous strength and challenging the other powers for control of the Wasteland. The sordid state of affairs in the Commonwealth is due in large part to the thwarting of a previous government that sought to unite the most powerful groups of the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth Provisional Government had involvement from many influential groups, including the Institute, until a synth entered one of the meetings and massacred many of the leaders. We don't know when this event occurred, but the Institute has been considered an enemy of the surface dwellers ever since. So, with a few well-established powers, one historical failed one, and some communities like Diamond City bordering on being a power of their own, we can see that in the over 200 years since the Great War, there have been many groups that have had the power and ambition to become something greater. Now, for many of you, that was just a review, and a pretty terrible one at that, but with all that information from each game fresh in your mind, let's talk about Fallout 3. Taking place in 2277, exactly 200 years after the Great War, the Lone Wanderer ventures out into a wasteland with only one regional power, the Brotherhood of Steel. By the time the player has completed the game, the Enclave is the only other faction that can challenge the Brotherhood of Steel. They struck out and were subsequently destroyed almost as quickly, with the destruction of their base at Raven Rock in the base game and the destruction of the mobile base crawler at Adams Air Force Base in the Broken Steel add-on. There is no other group that comes close to being a regional power in the Wasteland, and prior to the arrival of the Brotherhood of Steel in 2255, there was not even a recorded attempt by any group to do anything more than just survive. Megaton, Rivet City, and Canterbury Commons are some of the largest settlements but have no real capacity to project their power outside of their own communities. So let's do a quick exercise, only knowing information about the factions and powers of each game and knowing that the natural progression of society after the Great War is to start as small groups, where some eventually grow larger and more influential over time. Where would you place Fallout 3? Fallout 76? Well, things started off like how you'd expect, but now everyone's dead, so it definitely came after that. The first Fallout has some well-established groups, although none of them are the size or influence to be considered a regional power. Let's sit on that for a second. Fallout 2 has one very large faction, the NCR, and some other fairly large ones that we know are influential at the time Fallout 2 takes place, but end up destroyed or incorporated into the NCR. So that definitely seems more developed than the Wasteland of Fallout 3. Fallout New Vegas and 4 come after Fallout 2 and also have more well-developed powers, and in the case of 4, at least a historical attempt at a unified government, meaning that Fallout 3 would seem to slot in before Fallout 2. We could get really specific in analyzing exactly where Fallout 3 should take place between Fallout and Fallout 2, but I think that is sufficient to get the idea that the maturity of Fallout 3's Wasteland would be more appropriate between the years of 2161, when Fallout 1 starts, and 2241 when Fallout 2 starts. Given that there was absolutely no form of influential government in Fallout 3 until 2251, when a faction marched across the country and took mercy on the poor souls of the capital wastes, I would actually push Fallout 3's Wasteland closer to Fallout 1 than 2. But what is that I hear? 1,000 cries from the depths of the internet yelling, "But Rad King, the super mutants, they are the reason the capital Wasteland remains a lawless hellscape." Let's consider this mitigating factor, since, yes, the capital Wasteland has been dealing with a disorganized raiding horde of super mutants since 2078, which is nearly 200 years. This would definitely have an effect, but how much of an effect? The Commonwealth Wasteland has been subjected to raiding super mutants, discarded by the Institute in numbers sufficient to be found all over Boston and beyond. Super mutants were attacking settlements by 2180, meaning that the Commonwealth has been dealing with super mutant attacks for about half the time as the capital Wasteland, yet has also organically developed two factions and almost had a unified government. I would argue, if anything, that a threat as great as the super mutants would force communities to band together for mutual protection, which could serve as the seed for a regional government. Indeed, it is this exact scenario that played out in the Commonwealth in 2180 when Wastelanders banded together to defend Diamond City from a super mutant attack that formed the group that came to be known as the Minutemen. So while I do think that the super mutant attacks have had a detrimental influence on the progress of the capital Wasteland, I do not think it would be so extreme that no large local governments could develop for 178 years after the Great War, until the Brotherhood of Steel arrives in 2255. By 2255, in Fallout's timeline, every location that games take place in have large factions, usually more than one, reshaping the Wasteland into a true post-apocalyptic world. All things considered, in this particular aspect, the maturity of Fallout 3's Wasteland is definitely more appropriate before all games, except perhaps the first Fallout. However, I think it could be argued that it is even less developed than the first Fallout. Regardless, this is a very noteworthy aspect of Fallout 3 that makes it seem to feel out of time, especially when compared to every other game in the series, and for this reason, I believe this is one of the stronger evidences that Fallout 3 was originally intended to take place earlier in the Fallout timeline. Number 5. Circumstantial Evidence. The last section is dedicated to circumstantial evidence from Fallout 3 that, in my estimation, provides the greatest evidence of the theory. In isolation, no single one of these is of much consequence, and indeed can, and have, been adequately justified or explained. However, it is not the power of one of these to convince you, but the weight of all of them together that becomes too hefty to just hand wave away. The first piece of evidence that I'm going to examine is agriculture and Fallout 3's lack of any widespread farming. Examining all the settlements, both minor and major throughout the capital Wasteland, there are startling few instances of agriculture. There isn't a complete lack of agriculture, so it can't be argued that it was totally forgotten about by Bethesda. However, there's only one real farm, if you want to call it that, and it is found at Rivet City of all places. It is kind of ironic that the only settlement that is actually growing things is on a giant steel ship. Anyway, Dr. Lee is conducting research into hydroponics, and as a result, there's a rather substantial hydroponic farm at Rivet City. It grows enough produce that Rivet City is able to trade the produce to traders and surrounding settlements. No other settlement is seen growing produce. Even old derelict farms and farmsteads are not seen with Wastelanders attempting to grow produce. That has not always been the case, however. At an unmarked location, simply referred to as the Hilltop Farm Ruins, there is a terminal that records the attempts of a group of Great War survivors. They came to the farm to grow crops and raise animals with mixed results. Using irrigation techniques, they record seeing some crops grow and remark how all the goats and chickens die, but the cattle seem to be doing pretty fine. No other mention is made of the success or failure of the crops, as the survivors were killed or perhaps driven off by a group of people that noticed their presence. There is no other mention of agriculture, and no other settlement other than Rivet City shows successful produce growth in the whole game. Not even at Oasis, which seems like it could be a farming powerhouse since plants grow so freely there. It stretches the suspense of disbelief to think that people have lived for 200 years since the Great War with no agriculture until Dr. Lee and her research successfully built hydroponic farms. This is particularly glaring when you consider that every single game in the entire series, both the Interplay games and the Bethesda games, feature agriculture, including Fallout 76. It is to be expected for plants to have great difficulty growing right after a large-scale nuclear event. But 200 years after? Fallout 3, which finds itself in the middle of all the games as far as the Fallout timeline goes, doesn't even come close to the amount of agriculture occurring in every other game. What is the usual explanation for this? Usually talking about the intense radiation that has afflicted the area and has caused plant life to struggle to grow. Is that a reasonable explanation? Sure, but let's also consider the next point. Project Purity plays a pivotal part in the plot and the people's process to progress past the post-apocalypse. I may or may not have spent 10 minutes trying to write that. Seriously though, Project Purity and its importance to the people in the Wasteland is the primary driver for the entirety of the plot. James abandons his son in Vault 101 to restart the project. The Enclave take over the Jefferson Memorial to hijack the project, and the game ends with the player deciding whether to use the project for good by creating water with reduced radiation, or to use it to spread FEV and kill all of those with mutations, which at this point includes just about everyone. Clean water or genocide? That's a real toughie right there. The importance of clean water is shown in-game, where beggars don't ask the player for money or for food, but purified water as they are sick of the irradiated stuff. Broken Steel drives this home further by showing how the aqua pura that is brought to the Wastelanders has to be under heavy guard, as those caravans are under constant threat by raiders because the aqua pura is so valuable. So while one might ask, how is it that dangerous levels of radiation seem to have contaminated Fallout 3's water for nearly 200 years, I think it is also important to ask, how have the organisms of the capital Wasteland not adapted in the 200 years since the Great War? We know from the children of Adam that some people are born with a natural immunity to radiation. If the water really was so dangerously irradiated for generations upon generations, there would be a significant portion of Wastelanders who would be immune to radiation entirely, like some children of Adam appear to be, or at least have a higher tolerance to radiation, meaning that the ambient radiation levels of the capital Wasteland are no longer harmful. This type of adaptation would really take the wind out of Project Purity's sails, since nature would naturally overcome over several generations. The critical need for clean water would be much more appropriate in the years immediately following the Great War, where survivors find themselves succumbing to radiation poisoning from simply drinking water, and the quicker the water could be purified, the more lives that could be saved. The time to act is not 200 years after the bombs, but 2 years, since radiation would be an immediate and lasting threat for those that survived the bombs, fires, and violence that took so many lives. Unlike the point about agriculture, there actually have not been any great answers as to why Project Purity was not a priority much earlier, as it would have been critically important just after the war, and I would argue even more important since pre-war people would logically be more susceptible to radiation. The Wasteland Survival Guide is one of the more memorable quests in Fallout 3, given by the you either love her or hate her Moira Brown of Megaton. Although it is essentially a series of fetch quests, the variety of tasks and places it makes you explore make it entertaining, and it was really great to see that whether you successfully completed the task had an effect on the overall quality of the book. So while I have no problems with the quest itself, and indeed look forward to it on each playthrough of Fallout 3 I do, a good portion of it just does not make sense 200 years after the Great War. Let's take a look at the quest and the reason that the quest was given in the first place. The why is fairly straightforward. Moira Brown tells the Lone Wanderer that the Wasteland is a dangerous place and that people would benefit from having a source of knowledge that would help them overcome the challenges of the wastes. The first chapter is dedicated to surviving day to day by finding safe places to find food and the dangers of radiation. Now, I would hate to be that guy that dashes a nice woman's dream, but who at this point, nearly 200 years after the Great War, does not know that radiation is dangerous or the kinds of places that you might be able to find food? Additionally, why is the chapter on finding food? The player character goes into an old super duper mart to see if food and medicine can still be found 200 years after the Great War, and this is supposed to somehow be useful to people whose parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents all survived the bleak aftermath of the Great War. The subsequent chapters of the book are not quite as basic as those I just mentioned, and could have utility for people regardless of whether they are new to a post-apocalyptic lifestyle or not. A valid response to this would be that Moira is just a fanciful girl. I mean, talk to her for 10 seconds and you'll figure out that not everything is alright in that little head of hers. So if that is the case, why does the Wasteland Survival Guide, if done well and with no dishonesty, give stat boosts and perks to the player's character? Additionally, 3Dog will sing the Lone Wanderer's praises if the survival guide is well researched and helpful, and on the flip side will berate the player if the survival guide is done poorly, as it is not only unhelpful but actually dangerous. If the survival guide had no value and was just a naive dream, then it would be of zero worth to anyone outside of Moira, and perhaps the experience gained by the player, but we can see that is not the case. Telling people to look in supermarkets that have been picked over and scavenged and raided and re-picked over for 200 years seems like terrible advice. And the information related to how dangerous radiation should be is an absolute no-brainer for a wasteland that is supposedly suffering mightily under the dark cloud of radiation permeating everything, especially the water. The survival guide, or portions of it at least, would be next to useless for people living 200 years after the Great War. But would be legitimately useful for those that have just survived the Great War and are trying to eke out a new existence in the newly formed Wasteland. Mama Dolces is an interesting location not far from the Arlington Cemetery that was a business that manufactured sweets. The sinister background of the company was not their attempts to hook children on super sweet and unhealthy foods, but it was a front for the Chinese government to infiltrate American society, gather intel, and participate in all manner of cloak and dagger activities. The location is interesting enough just on those merits, and is made even more interesting by the fact that there is a radio signal coming from the facility that is still on air, spewing Chinese propaganda designed to lower morale of any patriotic American listening. Even that is still not the whole story, because it is still, 200 years later, filled with ghoulified Chinese soldiers who have presumably been there since the bombs fell. What I don't understand is how after 200 years have the Chinese ghouls not left? How have there not been whispers amongst Wastelanders that there seem to be hostile and foreign-speaking ghouls that solely inhabit and defend a building amongst the DC ruins? Why are there sugar bombs still left in the building? Those should have been eaten up literal lifetimes ago. Again, we can explain these points with very specific responses and a little sprinkling of conjecture, but at what point is it easier and more probable that they were included in the game when the idea was that it was not 200 years after the Great War? Vault 101 was one of the lucky vaults in that the experiment being conducted was not as nefarious as the others in the capital Wasteland. No experimental drugs, subliminal messaging, or research into FEV or clones. The directive is simple. Do not under any circumstance let people in or out, and live in the vault perpetually to study the effects of extremely long-term survival under vault conditions. To this end, we see that is more or less how the vault operates, making a few exceptions for people leaving and others entering, like the Lone Wanderer's father, James. It makes sense that Vault-Tec built this vault to last, and boy did they do a good job, because by the time the player character leaves the vault, it is in perfect condition. There are no noticeable failures, breakdowns, or other complications that would compromise the vault's ability to sustain life. When we contrast this with one of the other vaults in the series that has sustained vault dwellers for over 200 years, Vault 81 from Fallout 4 comes to mind. Originally meant to be an experimentation vault, there was a secondary hidden portion of the vault where scientists could create infectious pathogens and then expose the vault population to them in an attempt to test a cure-all or a disease panacea. The overseers sabotaged the secret vault systems, meaning that the experiments could not take place, and the vault was able to live blissfully unaware of the sinister fates they narrowly avoided. Fast forward 200 years though, and the vault is completely falling apart. It is a major point the game tries to drive home, as people are constantly working, fixing, and replacing portions of the vault that are failing, and as a result are dependent on the outside world to source some of their needed materials. Although the purpose of Vault 81 was different from 101, the differences between the vaults is drastic. I get the feeling that no thought was put into how complicated systems of Vault 101 would probably run into complications or issues with time, especially the longer the experiment went on. However, no such issues are mentioned, once again reinforcing this creeping feeling that the reason the natural wearing out of critical systems and inevitable repairs are never mentioned or alluded to are because the game was not meant to take place when it does. Again, this is not a perfect comparison between Vault 101 and Vault 81, but is yet another detail that is worth noting. Megaton, the largest settlement close to Vault 101, is often the first community players encounter. It is memorable for many reasons, including a gate that appears to be powered by an old turbine engine, as well as being built entirely in a crater with a live nuclear bomb in the middle. All those things aside, Megaton is one of the best settlements in Fallout 3, and yet its history is a little bit off. Megaton is actually one of the oldest settlements in the capital Wasteland, having been settled by survivors of the Great War, and more importantly, a group of people that tried to gain entrance to Vault 101, but were denied. That is an important detail because it shows how early Megaton was created, even if it did not resemble the 2277 version that we encounter in-game. Manya Vargas is the most reliable source of information relating to Megaton's history, stating that her great-grandfather was part of the founding group, starting as simply a refuge from dust storms that seemed to have dominated the wasteland right after the bombs. It ended up becoming a trading settlement. 2 generations would pass before efforts would be made to construct a wall. Manya Vargas's dad, having gained considerable wealth from the trading in Megaton, pushed heavily for the erection of a wall to protect the settlement from raiders, and construction began in 2241. That means that Megaton survived as a settlement despite raider attacks, and super mutant attacks as well, for nearly 164 years. I find it hard to believe that it took that long for the settlement to build protective walls, especially considering that it was a well-known trading settlement from the very beginning. Of course, we could come up with a number of reasons and justifications for this, but at the end of the day, I believe the simplest explanation is that the timeline was stretched to fit the official Fallout 3 start year of 2277. The Naval Research Institute was a pre-war group of scientists, likely mirroring the real-world United States Naval Research Laboratory. From the time of the Great War to around 2239, this group that we know scarcely a thing about survived as a group of scientists and moved to what was then a derelict old ship to increase living and lab space. That is 162 years of doing Adam knows what before establishing themselves on the ship that would become Rivet City, meaning also that arguably the largest settlement in the entire capital Wasteland grew to its size in just 38 years. Is this type of thing impossible? Certainly not. Does it seem anachronous, especially considering who founded it? Yeah, it does. The peak of the research being done in Rivet City consists of a portable power system that ends up aiding the Brotherhood in restarting Project Purity, hydroponic farms, and Horace Pinkerton's research into surgical procedures that allowed him to change the synth Harkness's face and even wipe memories and plant new ones. For over 160 years of work since the Great War, that is shockingly low-tech research for Fallout standards. For reference, the Institute and the Commonwealth, who are probably the most analogous of all Fallout groups to the Naval Research Institute, created organic robots near indistinguishable from real organisms by 2227, so 12 years before the Naval Research Institute moved to Rivet City so they could keep growing apples and potatoes. The Institute had created functional organic humanoids. Similarly, the Enclave in Fallout 2 with their FEV research were able to create a hybrid of monster and machine that was one of the most dangerous beings in the whole Wasteland. Meanwhile, the Naval Research Institute was doing what exactly? I feel like it goes without saying at this point, but doesn't the story of the Naval Research Institute, their moving to Rivet City, and the kind of research they were doing more appropriate for a much earlier time in the capital Wasteland? Power, food, and a stint helping with Project Purity and cleansing water, that is the kind of research done when it is needed most. And that time would be when all the pre-war systems that readily provided these things would have suddenly and catastrophically stopped working. It is like my car breaking down, and then 200 years later I go back to it and start troubleshooting to fix it. It makes more sense earlier in Fallout's timeline than 2277. Vault 112 is a secret and little well-known vault that is home to a brilliant scientist, Dr. Stanislaus Braun, several unwitting vault dwellers turned science experiments, and probably the nicest robo-brains we have in the entire Wasteland. That is not exactly a high bar to clear, but time has not been kind to those squishy little brains. One of the best portions of the main quest takes place here, Tranquility Lane. So what could I possibly mention here that would indicate that Fallout 3 hints that it was meant to take place earlier in the timeline? It actually has nothing to do with Tranquility Lane and more to do with the humans that are in Vault 112, who have been there for over 200 years. Upon entry to the vault, the RoboBrain will tell the Lone Wanderer that they are 202.3 years behind schedule, meaning that if we assume that it is still the year 2277 when the quest is completed, that these people were actually brought to the vault before the Great War. While a bit unusual, I don't think it is that weird. What I do find weird, however, is these pre-war people have had their bodies preserved for 2 centuries, and while it is obvious that their survival is entirely dependent on the pods at this point, this is another instance where we are left to believe that Vault-Tec had this life-prolonging technology that goes unused and unmentioned except to extend the life of a handful of people in Vault 112. It is a much simpler explanation if these people were still within their natural lives, or perhaps extended a little bit outside of their natural human life, but instead we are left with a vault of bicentennial people with really no indication that they would ever eventually die. Not even the genius Robert House could get his life-prolonging tech to work as well as Vault 112's, since Robert House looks like a reanimated corpse, whereas the Dwellers, if we want to call them that, seem to look much better. It is a bit hard to tell because of the obstructed view into the pods, but Dr. Brown, while looking old, at least doesn't look like a mummy. Again, taking place earlier in the Fallout's timeline would sidestep all of these issues that I just mentioned with Vault 112. If you have ever thought about the possibility that Fallout 3 was originally meant to take place earlier, you have no doubt thought of the big anomaly, Little Lamplight. Little Lamplight, for those that are unaware, or it has been a while, is a community tucked away in a cave that connects to Vault 87, that has existed since the day the bombs dropped and persists 200 years later, consisting entirely of children. Yes, children, and only children, since as soon as someone turns 16, they are kicked out and forced to live in Big Town, preserving the community as a domain for only the youngest children. We are once again forced to reconcile the fact that a group of children, and only children, have been able to survive multiple generations in an environment that most adults themselves cannot survive in. It leads to a number of questions that have spawned a number of responses since Fallout 3's release in 2008. First and foremost, how would a child society possibly sustain itself for multiple generations? We know they themselves aren't having kids, because a game that does not let you harm children in any way is not going to entertain that idea at all, and for that I am grateful. That would mean the source of children would have to be outside the community, and indeed, one of the well-known quests, those, involves finding a new home for the orphan Brian Wilkes. One of the possibilities is to convince him to move to Little Lamplight, providing some insight as to how the community may continue to exist. Some children may be found by exploration groups that come out of Little Lamplight sometimes, or there's enough awareness of Little Lamplight that surrounding areas may send children who are without parents or any way to care for themselves to the community. Certainly, not one of the most elegant of explanations, but it's passable. We are also left wondering, how could a group of children provide for themselves? Protect themselves? Forage or grow food? Fight? Repair things? The list could go on and on really, but the common response to this is that the children did have an adult with them just before the Great War that worked to help educate the children, and after that adult's death, the children have been able to pass this knowledge down sufficiently to survive. This is reinforced by the fact that there is a school where the children teach and receive instruction and training in order to ensure the survival of Little Lamplight. If one of those classes is about vulgarities, we all know who aced that class, Little Twerp. So if they indeed are able to pass along knowledge sufficient for survival at such a young age, then why are the residents of Big Town the most useless and ignorant wastelanders you can possibly encounter? They come from Little Lamplight, with knowledge enough to defend and provide for themselves. Did all that knowledge just fall out of their heads as they ran for their lives screaming across the wasteland all the way to Big Town? Why is Big Town so far away anyway? Big Town's inability to do anything but respire and metabolize food is a biting indictment of Little Lamplight's education system and really disproves any notion that they are adequately equipped with the knowledge and skills necessary to survive. Lastly, 200 years is a long time, and I find it hard to believe that raider groups and other explorers would not have found them within 2 centuries of roaming the wastes. If a malicious group caught wind of a bunch of kids holed up in a defensible cave system with an unknown amount of items to pillage and loot, you know that they would be considered prime targets. Given their proximity to Vault 87, which is ground zero for the super mutant threat that blankets the capital Wasteland in green rage monsters, how have the super mutants not found the kids in Little Lamplight? The main quest takes the player character through the Little Lamplight cave system that connects directly to the vault, and it is so incredibly lucky that the front entrance to Little Lamplight has not been discovered. The more time that goes by, the more likely the community is to be discovered, and we are supposed to believe that they've been able to accomplish this for 200 years? So, I have addressed some of the counter-arguments to this theory when addressing specific points, but there is one that I have not addressed, and that is the presence of Harold. His presence would seem to indicate that sometime after Fallout 2 is the latest possible date that Fallout 3 could take place, and even then, it would have taken him a good amount of time to cross the entire continent and plant himself in what would become Oasis. For one, Harold could have spent a few years traveling, and the game still could have taken place earlier than 2277, since Fallout 2 takes place in 2241. However, all the evidence seems to indicate that a date after Fallout 2 is still too long after the Great War for Fallout 3's setting, and Oasis would need to be justified some other way, like maybe a graft of Harold was planted there, or just sidestep Harold altogether and come up with a different mechanism. That is, however, the only irreconcilable detail that I could think of, and if we had to trade one Harold for everything else previously mentioned, it would be much easier to explain away or change Oasis' story. So, after all of that, where does that leave us? I think it is illustrative to visualize this a little bit. Here are all the points mentioned in this essay that don't make sense given the time that Fallout 3 is set in. Here are all the justifications needed to explain how these things can or could fit into a world 200 years after the Great War. That is quite the list. Now here's how many would need explicit justification if Fallout 3 took place much earlier than it really does. That, in my mind, speaks volumes to this Fallout theory, and if we are going to use and abuse everyone's favorite razor, Occam's razor, it seems more likely that Fallout 3 was meant to take place much earlier, as 90% of all these issues can be addressed with one simple change. So if this video has convinced you to jump off the fence, you may wonder, okay, so when did they intend for this game to take place? And to that, I give you a very pathetic answer, I don't know. There are many dates thrown around, some say 20 years after the Great War, some say 30, some say 50. A popular one is that it was meant to take place at the same time as the first Fallout, and essentially run parallel to the story unfolding on the West Coast, but from the contextual clues, it's hard to say. If the state of the Wasteland is anything to go by, all things considered, like Washington DC's extra damage due to being a primary target, widespread radiation, and the super mutant threat starting from day one, I still think the Wasteland makes more sense taking place before Fallout 1. The issues trying to be addressed by Project Purity and the other research going on would seem to address needs of survivors of the Great War and maybe the generation after, but less so for those people's great-grandchildren. I would prefer it to take place around 2100, either a bit before or a bit after, as that seems to make the most sense given all the inconsistencies we've gone over. And to reiterate what I said at the top, nothing would keep Bethesda from giving a small explanation for the Brotherhood or Enclave. Either the Brotherhood started similar to the Appalachian Brotherhood, having been in remote contact with Roger Maxson, or the Brotherhood and the Enclave made very early attempts to get to the nation's capital because, well, it was the nation's capital. The Enclave claimed to be the legitimate continuance of the United States, and the Brotherhood is interested in recovering technology, which could theoretically be in abundance wherever large urban areas or important pre-war areas are. In fact, people often criticize Elder Lyons for governing counter to the mainstream Brotherhood beliefs, that securing technology took precedence above all. Fallout 76 tells us that Roger Maxson did not value technology above all else, and it would have been great if Elder Lyons knew Roger Maxson and his beliefs, took them to heart, and that impacted how he would govern his forces in the capital Wasteland. Now, I think a possible explanation for all the points that I discussed earlier would be that many elements of the game were created before the main storyline, and therefore the timeline was decided. This would mean that popular creative ideas that may have been formed when thinking of a more immediate post-apocalyptic setting were carried over and adapted to the new timeline. So thank you for looking at this deep dive into an interesting and, in my opinion, compelling theory. Please tell me in the comments whether you agree or disagree. Were you convinced? If you have extra information for or against this theory that I did not discuss, I would be interested to hear it and see the conversations that they spawn. Remember, at the end of the day, we are all here because we love Fallout, and we love talking about Fallout, so keep things civil and in good faith. Let's get on to the final part of all my videos, the comment highlights. These comments are from my previous video, which was the third video of the Food of Fallout. Most comments were talking about exactly what I thought most people would want to talk about, the iguana meat paradox. The comments and discussions covered a wide range of things, everything from the meat not really being iguana meat, to maybe iguanas mutating and being able to survive all across the United States, to maybe people referring to any lizard other than a gecko as an iguana, so in reality it would all just be some sort of reptile meat. I think there are good points brought up by everyone, but I do want to say something to the numerous comments just saying it is all human meat. It is certainly possible that it is human meat given the quest in Fallout 1, however, it is also apparent that there is real iguana meat since Iguana on a Stick shows a real iguana and Iguana Bob's stand shows dead hanging iguanas. So Iguana on a Stick in the early games is for sure iguana, but iguana bits could be, and often is, something else. This is doubly interesting since in the later Fallout games, Iguana on a Stick goes from being a whole iguana to just chunks of meat on a stick, which could be a hint that it is not really iguana meat, since we don't see any iguanas in later games, in the wild, or cooked on a stick. Someone really needs to talk to Bethesda and get this mess sorted out. Lantern's Glow mentioned that in Fallout 4 the Yao Guai steak is bugged. Instead of just adding a bit to strength, it is actually multiplying it. Thanks for the catch there. Sam Morris hopped in to let us all know that squirrel can actually be pretty good, and I honestly would be down to try a properly made squirrel dish. I just have to say, Sam, you are doing Kentucky no favors by reinforcing the squirrel-eating stereotype. Enda Burns brought up a great point that in Fallout New Vegas, the quest Bleed Me Dry has you collect a number of eggs, and at one point has you pillage a rad scorpion nest for some rad scorpion eggs. I had previously stated how scorpions do not lay eggs, and theorized that Wastelanders were getting eggs from cutting open killed rad scorpions, but this definitely contradicts that. I just wonder now why we don't see more rad scorpion egg clusters, and this new egg-laying behavior would seem to be another mutation the Emperor Scorpion has undergone. Several of you let me know I was not alone in mispronouncing mute fruit. There are dozens of us. I don't feel so alone anymore. Smug Dragon brought up a great point that the blood sausage is not considered in-game as a food or even a medicinal item. Instead, it is a chem. That would explain why it is not allowed in the fort or to be consumed by legionaries, because chems are not allowed. This can be seen by the fact that it does not reduce hunger or water levels in survival, and the healing is affected by the chemist and day tripper perks. Now that I know blood sausage is a chem, I can't wait to see it on the news as the new cool drug all the kids are doing these days. This brings us to the end, but fear not, I will be back in 2 weeks with yet another video. Take care of yourselves, my friends, and may Adam bless you.